This video was brought to you by Surfshark. Hello friends, my name is JJ, and as we all know, Donald Trump will soon become the second ever US president with a gap between his terms at just 4 years. It is not a very long gap, the same as the first president with 2 non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland, who also had a 4-year gap. This sort of thing isn't that uncommon among world leaders, with politicians as disparate as Churchill, Silvio Berlusconi, Viktor Orban, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and Indira Gandhi all getting elected back to power a few years after being voted out. A more extreme example, however, would be former California Governor Jerry Brown. He was re-elected to a 3rd term as governor in 2010 after a 28-year gap since the end of his 2nd term way back in 1983. Brown was elected to his 1st term in 1975 when he was just 36 years old, and by the time he was elected to his 3rd non-consecutive term, he was now 72, and this made him both the youngest and oldest governor in California history. But wildly enough, Jerry Brown is somehow not the only US governor to achieve this distinction. Consider former West Virginia Governor Cecil Underwood. Cecil was first elected governor in 1956 when he was 34. He stepped down in 1961 to make a failed bid for the Senate, but then stayed active in West Virginia politics for many decades to come. And then in 1996, when he was in his early 70s, he was finally elected to a 2nd term as governor. An amazing 36 years after his first. This meant a gap of 5 other governors between his first inauguration and his 2nd, including one guy who himself served 2 non-consecutive terms. And what this means is that if you are a boomer-aged person in West Virginia, you had the same governor during both the Eisenhower and Clinton presidencies. Perhaps one of the craziest examples of this sort of thing of all, however, comes from the nation of Bulgaria. In 1946, Bulgaria's child monarch, King Simeon II, was deposed by Soviet forces, beginning the country's long era of communist rule. King Simeon went into exile, but returned to his country after the fall of communism. And then, in 2001, he was elected back to power 55 years later. He couldn't be king again because the Bulgarian monarchy had long since been abolished, but he did serve a single 4-year term as prime minister. And in that role, he briefly functioned as a kind of symbol of the restoration of Bulgaria's pre-communist past. So I have always been fascinated with this concept of long breaks. There is just something kind of equal parts inspiring and audacious about someone thinking that they can go back and finish something that they started decades ago. It's like those stories you sometimes hear about some old guy who finally went back and got his high school diploma after dropping out in the 1940s or something. And it's not just something that happens in politics either. The world of pop culture is awash in sequels and spin-offs and restorations that were in many cases decades in the making. And today I thought I would give you some of my favorite examples. But only after we make a gap in this video with a few words from today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Hello friends, today I'm at the fabulous Port of Vancouver. So navigating the internet can be a big scary adventure, and just like any adventure, before you head out, it is important to have a well-stocked inventory. You want a good browser, a good system for organizing all of your favorites, maybe one of those apps that keeps track of your passwords, and of course, a VPN. VPNs do all sorts of useful things. They protect the security of your internet connection when you're using dodgy public Wi-Fi. They let you avoid government regimes of censorship or control, and they confuse sites like Netflix into letting you watch stuff that's supposed to be region locked. Even if you don't use your VPN every day, it is always a useful tool to have on hand when you need it. And when it comes to VPN providers, you cannot beat Surfshark. Not only is Surfshark the most affordable of the big 3 VPN providers, and not only does it have cross-platform compatibility, but it also includes several bonus features like data breach monitoring, malware detection, and ad blocking. So really, it is like multiple tools in one. Anyway, if you think Surfshark is right for you, and it clearly is, just scan this QR code or click on the link in the thing below. Right now, they are having an amazing Black Friday promotion where if you sign up for a 24-month subscription, you get a bonus 4 months absolutely free. And if that seems like too much of a commitment, just remember that with Surfshark, you always get a 30-day money-back guarantee. So don't leave a hole in your internet inventory. Sign up for Surfshark today and equip yourself for your online adventure. So when it comes to long-delayed sequels to movies, nobody beats the Walt Disney Corporation. Beginning in the 1990s, the company realized that there was a lot of money to be made in churning out direct-to-video follow-ups to some of their golden era animated features, thereby giving the children of the world something new to watch on endless repeat on their parents' DVD players. In 2002, Disney released Lady and the Tramp 2, 47 years after the original Lady and the Tramp was released in 1955. Peter Pan Return to Neverland also came out in 2002 and was released 49 years after the original film, which came out in 1952. Cinderella 2 was then released 53 years after the original Cinderella from 1950, but even that was nothing compared to Bambi 2, which came out in 2006, an incredible 65 years after the original film debuted in 1941. A shallow cash grab, perhaps, but given that literally everyone associated with the first movie was long dead by that point, you didn't hear a lot of complaints. In fact, in almost all of these cases, pretty much no one from the original Disney movies participated in the sequels because they were all either incredibly old or dead. But when Square Enix released their Disney-themed game Kingdom Hearts in 2002, they put an unusual bit of effort into ensuring that their game would have continuity with one of the classic Disney characters that they used. Alice from Alice in Wonderland appears in Kingdom Hearts 1, and she is voiced by Catherine Beaumont, the same actress who voiced her in Disney's original 1951 animated feature.
Do you play croquet?
Why, yes, Your Majesty.
Back then, Catherine was just 10 years old, but when Square Enix came a-callin', she was now 64 and hadn't played the character in 51 years. But I'm sure the Disney purists were happy.
Of course! I've done absolutely nothing wrong.
Now, in terms of long-delayed movie sequels that actually have some continuity with their original cast and crew, the 2017 Blade Runner sequel, which came out 35 years after the original, would be a good contender. Both movies starred Harrison Ford, and director Ridley Scott returned as well, though this time just as an executive producer. Many of the other long-delayed sequels to 80s-era movies that have come out recently have a similar story. Mad Max Fury Road came out 30 years after the last Mad Max movie and has the same director. Tron Legacy, meanwhile, came out 28 years after the original Tron, with both movies starring Jeff Bridges. Mark Hamill and the late Carrie Fisher, meanwhile, were famous for taking a 32-year break from playing their iconic roles in the Star Wars series, and were widely praised upon their return to the big screen. Right? And then, of course, there's this whole recent bout of 90s-era sitcoms being brought back for the benefit of aging millennials like me who refuse to like anything new. Of the ones that dragged their full original casts out of retirement, the longest gaps include the 2016 reboot of Full House, which reassembled the original cast after a 20-year break, the 2018 Roseanne reboot, which ended a 21-year break for their cast, and the 2023 Night Court reboot, which ended a 31-year hiatus for the original cast of that show. Although, to be fair, most of the original cast of Night Court had died by that point, so the original cast was now just 2 people. Returning to a job that you gave up decades ago is something that you even see in sports now and then. Mike Tyson's recent fight with old what's-his-face was probably one of the most intense examples of a professional athlete returning to a sport after a really long break. Tyson retired from professional boxing in 2005, making his fight with Jake Paul his first sanctioned match in 19 years. And you never would have known. I mean, to be fair, trying to get back into professional sports after taking a break of a decade or more is by far the most unusual manifestation of this whole phenomenon, just because the body doesn't really work that way and most athletes know it. It does occasionally happen though. The beloved 80s era Brazilian soccer player Romario retired from professional football in 2008 at 42, which was already a pretty long career. But then this year, he announced that he would be coming back after a 16-year gap to play for a professional Rio team at age 58. His 30-year-old son is also a player on the team, which is not something you see very often. Turning now to the Highbrow set. In 2019, Margaret Atwood finally released a sequel to her famous novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which came out in 1985 for a gap of 35 years. She was beat only slightly by Stephen King, who took 36 years to write a sequel to his iconic 1977 novel, The Shining, which he did in 2013. The most infamous example of a long-delayed book sequel, however, is probably Go Set a Watchman, which was the 2015 sequel to everybody's favorite mandatory reading novel from the 10th grade, To Kill a Mockingbird, which was written in 1960. Despite the enormous success of To Kill a Mockingbird, the author, Harper Lee, famously never wrote another book for many decades and became something of a recluse. But then, 55 years later, in the final months of her life, she finally released the sequel. And according to most reviews, it was not worth the wait. Bands are, of course, famous for breaking up and then having their fans beg them to get back together, and sometimes the begging works, but only after a long while. The 70s era rock band The Eagles famously broke up in 1980 and vowed they would only get back together once hell freezes over, and then they did get back together 14 years later and released an album entitled Hell Freezes Over.
For the record, we never broke up, we just took a 14-year vacation.
American Football, which is an emo-type band that I'm quite fond of, went even longer. They broke up after releasing their first album in 1998, and then they went 17 years before reuniting to make their second album in 2016. But here is a really extreme example. Have you ever heard of the 60s era band The Zombies? They were never all that famous, but they did produce one of the most iconic singles of the age that you now almost always hear in movies about the 60s.
It's the time of the season.
Anyway, they broke up in 1967, and while certain members made attempts to reunite during the 1990s, the full band didn't get back together to make a new album until 2004, a staggering 36 years after the breakup. And according to Pitchfork, it was basically the Go Set a Watchman of reunion albums. In the realm of video games, it took Nintendo 26 years to make a sequel to Kid Icarus for the NES, Kid Icarus Uprising for the DS. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is one of the single longest gaps between games in a video game franchise. That is, unless you count the recently released sequel to the infamous 1994 Super Nintendo game Shaq Fu. Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn was released in 2018, 24 years after the original. And amazingly enough, both involved the participation of Shaq. Speaking of B-tier celebrities, another one of these things that has always fascinated me has been when a celebrity marriage breaks up and then sometime later they go back to marrying each other again after several other marriages in between. I mean, I assume this must happen to normal people too, and you can let me know in the comments if it has ever happened to anybody that you know, but certainly the highest profile examples all come from celebrities. The pioneering comedian Richard Pryor married 7 times, 2 of which consisted of him remarrying women that he had previously divorced. His 4th and 7th wife was the same woman, Jennifer Lee, with their first marriage lasting from 1981 to 1982, and then their second marriage lasting from 2001 until Pryor's death in 2005. So a 19-year gap. It is actually a pretty melancholic story because Richard Pryor was a very troubled man, and near the end of his life, he reached out to his favorite wife to come back and take care of him in his final years as his health got progressively worse and he felt increasingly alone. Is that a romantic story? I don't know. Noted Mormon superstar Marie Osmond married basketballer Stephen Craig in 1982 and then divorced him in 1985. She then married some other guy and divorced him too, and then reunited with Steve and remarried him in 2011. It was a 28-year gap, conveniently measured by the 28-year-old son that their first marriage produced. Somewhat creepily, she wore the same dress at both weddings. I don't know why I've always found trivia about long gaps so fascinating. I guess it's probably because as you get older, it's easy for your mind to dwell on all of the opportunities that you've left behind, all of the doors that you've locked behind you, and all of these other thoughts that frame your past as this distant, abandoned place. But when you look at the careers and accomplishments of other successful people, you can find plenty of evidence suggesting that that doesn't have to be the case. It is entirely possible to return to your past and attempt to resume the things that you put aside years or even decades ago, whether that means getting rehired to an old job, completing the next chapter of an unfinished project, or rekindling an old relationship. That said, I think that the list of examples that we've looked at today suggests that returning to something after a long break can often be pretty risky. Time does march on, and the circumstances that made something work 15, 20, or more years ago won't necessarily still be the case today. Sometimes you really do only have one good book in you. But you know, other times it is worth questioning if you still do have more to give. Blade Runner 2049 got mostly glowing reviews. The Eagles continued to sell out shows after they got back together. Jerry Brown was considered a pretty good governor when he came back, and Richard Pryor's decision to reconnect with his fourth wife seems to have brought him some genuine joy in his final years. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Can you think of another good example of someone who came back to something after being away from it for a decade or more? Have you ever done something like that? Do you think you would like to? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and a subscribe. Do not forget to check out Surfshark, and I will see you next week.